Hi. So I'm Matt McAllister. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Film Production and Media Studies in the Donald Belisario College of Communications. And today we're here to celebrate the official launch of the new book from my friend and colleague, Matthew F. Jordan. His book is titled, as you can see behind us here, Danger Sound Klaxon, The Horn That Changed History, published by University of Virginia Press and available for purchase. After I introduce our author, we'll hear a reading from this exciting new book by the author himself. Then we'll watch a trailer for the book. They do trailers for books now. We'll take questions from you all after that. And we can't sell books here, but if you order them from the publisher or from a retailer, the author will be very happy to sign. Professor Matthew F. Jordan, our author, is a faculty member in and department head of Film Production and Media Studies. His research explores how different popular media forms and media technologies are used and have been used to constitute and reify aspects of personal identity and cultural ideology. He's written about different geographic contexts, including France, Britain, and America. And he is also a formidable public scholar, writing for such venues as The Conversation, The New Republic, and The Huffington Post. Much of Dr. Jordan's scholarship focuses on the intersection of history, cultural theory, and sound studies. His first book, Le Jazz, Jazz and French Cultural Identity, explored the history of jazz music in France. One reviewer called the book extremely readable and with far-reaching appeal. He has also written about the history of commercial noise in Grand Central Terminal in New York City, the othering ideology of noise-canceling headphones, and the meanings of the music on former President Barack Obama's iPod. Also in the realm of audio, he is the co-host with Leah Daches of the News Over Noise podcast, which I highly recommend, which is part of Penn State's News Literacy Initiative. Let's learn about his brand new book that also combines history, cultural theory, and sound studies, Danger Sound Klaxon, The Horn That Changed History. Dr. Matthew Jordan.
So I'm just going to read a little bit of an introduction because I think it helps frame the book. And then the trailer, which Ashley Searing, who's here, helped me edit, kind of gives you the plot points. So the intro plot points. All right. When Count de Suez opened the door to his favorite automobile dealer sometime late in 1910, he was looking for something new. An early convert to horseless carriage technology, he was well known in the motoring world, frequenting the salons and car races that spread the evangel of automobile culture. The Parisian dealer was known to stock the newest and most expensive accessories on the market, and the Count, who considered himself a pioneer of sort, liked to be the first to adopt the latest technological applications. As it happened, on that very day, an American salesman was also in Paris trying to sell the busy dealer on a new electrical signaling device that was all the rage in America. The conversation piqued the curiosity of the eavesdropping Count and his young wife. 5 years before, they had bought for their new car the French squeeze-bulb horns, the loudest signaling devices on the market. It swelled the Count's pride when their sound caused people to look as he cruised the boulevards in his Bébé Peugeot. These days, however, it seemed everyone had one. He wanted something new. Interrupting the American sales pitch, the Count said, "Let's hear it." The dealer shrugged and pulled an 8-volt battery from a shelf. The salesman quickly connected it to a shiny black metal apparatus and, with a glint in his eye, pushed a button. Oops. We try that again. He pushed the button. Aouka, it shrieked. The metallic noise of the American device was unlike anything anyone in the shop had ever heard. The Countess stumbled backward into a chair, unable to say a word. The half-terrified Count dropped his hat. Slowly a smile crept across his face as he caught the eye of the satisfied salesman, who nodded and said, "It's a Klaxon." "I must have it now," exclaimed the Count. "Quick, how much is it?" Why a Count, whose apocryphal story was told to Harper's Weekly readers early in 1911, would want an American Klaxon, a new communication device so shockingly loud that it assaulted the sensibilities of everyone who heard it, is the question at the heart of this book. What needs did this electrical technology promise to serve in a new century rapidly being transformed by a disruptive technology, the automobile? What does its rise and fall tell us about how emergent technologies become dominant, how they are advertised, monetized, embraced, or replaced? What does it teach us about how quickly we adapt after new technologies disrupt the way we hear, see, and perceive things in our everyday life world? This book tells the story of the rise and fall of the Klaxon, a mechanized signaling device that promised to help solve the safety problems that accompany the age of the automobile. The Klaxon's mechanical shriek was first heard as a brain-rattling noise, but as the conversations that helped usher it into culture shifted, the public's perception of that sound shifted over time. Auga became associated with commitment to public safety, made possible by electricity. In less than a decade, the Klaxon cornered the accessories market as the dominant communication technology for the automobile. At its height, 3 out of every 4 cars on roads the world over utilized it. Then, just as quickly, despite massive marketing campaigns to retain the association of its sound with public safety, it was rejected as an unwanted nuisance and replaced. Why? What forced the Klaxon, once an exciting technology for early adopters, into a decrescendo? Sound plays an outsized role as a driver of our ongoing negotiation of the space we share with each other, spurring us to confront how we want to live. In the late 1920s, John Dewey argued that, quote, connections of the ear with vital and outgoing thought and emotion are immensely closer and more varied than those of the eye. Vision is spectator, hearing is participator. As anyone who has been kept awake at night by noise can attest, it's not possible to avoid unwanted sound. New sounds or unwanted noises become the sites of cultural contestation, producing the conversations through which our sense of self and society emerge. I think this is what George Simmel meant when he asserted that hearing is by its very nature supra-individual. What happens in a room must be heard by all those present. So when people make sense of their changing soundscape, they're negotiating changes in the world they share, working through their hopes and concerns about aspects of society they confront every day. In what follows, when I use the word soundscape, I mean to signify and evoke something more than just, quote, general acoustic environment of a society, as R. Murray Schafer conceived of it when he coined the term. The sonic environment is important for understanding the changes in everyday life and the ongoing conversations by which we make sense of it. As the cultural sociologist Nick Coldry writes, oral terms have an advantage as a source of metaphors for thinking about the social world. When people talk and argue about the sounds they hear or the things or people that produce them, they're making sense of cultural change. Of course, how we interpret the different sounds that fill our life world is culturally contingent and also changes over time. This phenomenological point that the sounds we hear not only are related to the physical vibrations bouncing around us all the time, but also are mediated by cultural discourse that conditions our interpretation of them is an important one. Both sides of the soundscape, the physical and cultural frames of perception that guide our hearing, are apt to change when we adopt new technologies. This dialectical interplay between the objects that produce raw sounds and the discourses, social, political, commercial, juridical, academic, medical, scientific, etc., that guide how we hear them is an extremely revealing source for scholars of culture who study changes in how we perceive things over time. Plainly stated, our sense of hearing is conditioned by the things we hear every day. The French sociologist Henri Lefebvre, who turned the examination of everyday life into a field of study, once argued that our modes of perception through our senses are historically conditioned and contingent. Our activities, he wrote, are born from seeds contained in everyday practice. We learn quite simply from doing things every day. Our reason, quote, is formed in social practice as day follows trivial day. As day follows trivial day, the eye learns how to see, the ear learns how to hear. Feelings, ideas, lifestyles, and pleasures are confirmed in the everyday. So how we listen to, interpret, and evaluate everyday sounds is the product of this relationship between the things that produce physical sounds in our life world and our cultural frame for understanding them. In short, we make sense of sound. How we make sense of sound is historically contingent on the ongoing conversations about sound that is happening all around us. The word soundscape then is meant to connote this complex interplay between sounds produced and how our culture conditions us to hear them. Here I echo Emily Thompson's emphasis in The Soundscapes of Modernity, where she argues that the soundscape is simultaneously a physical environment and a way of perceiving that environment. It is both a world and cultural construct to make sense of that world. What we hear is contingent on the ways of understanding sound that are established by culture as people negotiate the complex relationships between new sounds and our conditioned expectations of what the world around us should sound like. In this book, I trace how a sound created by a new technology, the Klaxon automobile horn, underwent a metamorphosis of perceived value, molded by the ongoing conversation about its presence in the changing human soundscape. Like Thompson, I turned to history and archival material to understand the Klaxon's presence in the soundscape, situating its revolutionary sound in a rapidly changing modernity during a period when the automobile was disrupting every nook and cranny of everyday life. As a case study, the story of the rise and fall of the Klaxon, the first great electrical communication device of the automobile age, dramatizes how the soundscape is tied to our everyday use of and faith in technology. One could say that every age is defined by the technologies that transform how people live. In the story of modernity, few technologies have been as dynamically disruptive as the automobile. At the beginning of the 20th century, this now dominant technology quickly became a site for contestation of meaning, spurring an ongoing conversation about its place in society. In many ways, I see the debate surrounding the emergence and eventual dominance of automobiles and automobility as a precursor to the feverish contemporary debate we're having about smartphones. Today's smartphone technology is causing major disruptions, changing everything about the way we mediate and orient ourselves to our physical space and transforming the way we experience it. It has changed the way we think and communicate, the way our economy works, the way we govern ourselves, the way our cities are designed, and the way we work and live. At the turn of the century, it was the automobile technology that revolutionized our shared world. It shifted our frames of cultural orientation and altered our sense of perception, especially our experience of the soundscape. To understand the paradigm shift in the soundscape, I searched for traces of the ongoing debate in the archives and reconstructed the conversations around me. The striking thing about this debate is that, like the technology it followed, it is at the same time remarkably transcultural or global and extremely local. Like the automobile, the Klaxon disrupted the global soundscape simultaneously, yet Klaxon technology and the various modern modes of communicating, advertising, and doing business associated with it originated in America, which made Klaxon an early example of a kind of technological and cultural Americanization that was contested in whatever local context its herald sound was heard. That anxious tension about what the new American sound meant for cultures where its presence was heard, what they had been, what they might become, remained a constant throughout its rise and fall. Okay, now time for a trailer. In a world transformed by disruptive technology, the automobile quickly changed the look, feel, and sound of modern life. Streets already filled with people, horse carriages, and trolleys now had to look out for cars. Other means of transportation had distinct signaling devices to let people know they were coming. Eventually, consensus emerged that squeeze bulb air horns should be the distinctive sound of automobiles. But as the number of cars grew, the squeeze horn was too hard to hear over the chaos. In 1909, Miller Reese Hutchison solved this problem by inventing an electric signaling device that made a loud, noisy, metallic shriek at the touch of a button. At first, people who heard it recoiled immediately. Yet the Lovell McConnell Company heard that electronic noise as a marketable safety signal and called it the Klaxon. Using psychologically sophisticated modern advertising, they slowly persuaded the public that Klaxon's metallic shriek would make driving more safe. Revolutionizing the consumer technology business, they spread Klaxon technology around the world.
But when they sold Klaxons to the Army to use as alarm signals during the Great War, its brand association began to change. After the war, when people heard Klaxons in the streets, they were reminded of death in the trenches. Cultures turned against Klaxon technology as a noise to be silenced.
I'm sorry, boss, but I got the sidewalk blues.
This is the story of the rise and fall of the Klaxon, the horn that changed history.
Okay, now we're going to turn to the question and answer part. And so I encourage you, if you have questions, to ask our distinguished author. But I'm going to take the MC's prerogative and ask the first question, if you don't mind. So I know that Klaxon, there's a lot of perspectives you could take on it, which you do. The impact on kind of sound in society and the sound of urbanity and the various industrial strategies the Klaxon company used and its global nature. But I do, my own research is on advertising, critical advertising studies. So my question is going to be about that. I wonder if you could talk about Klaxon as an advertising innovator. So I think the trailer said psychologically sophisticated modern advertising techniques. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So it just so happens that I can show you some images from this. So there's a kind of an old saw in advertising history. This kind of comes from Raymond Williams that advertising in its early stages was this: just announce the price for something and what it was, right? And this is the first. And it has a little bit of the kind of associations they're going for. The X-ray of sound was their first big campaign. X-ray was a kind of a new invention then. It kind of it piqued the imagination of people interested in this new electrical stuff. But as you can see, it's just the price and what it is, right? So that's kind of the first moment of what they were doing. And then what they moved to was this, right? What I'd call situational advertising. Raymond Williams calls it situational advertising, but that's what I call it as well. And so you can see what it's doing is it's pulling the reader. It's selling two things. It's selling automobility, the idea of the automobile culture, because when this came out, it's still a pretty small percentage of people who were driving automobiles. But it gives you a situation where you have to imagine yourself as somebody who has a moral choice to make, right? And in this case, it's appealing to the person who's thinking about the mother of the kids who are playing in traffic, right? The whole idea, I don't know if you can read it from there, but it's always absent-minded people who are walking through streets clueless. And remember, this is before kind of traffic signals or road lines or sidewalks, really kind of people mingled in the streets. So kids would be playing, and the idea is this horn will keep people from getting killed. So you, consumer, this is the moral choice you have to make. Do you want to adopt our new technology, or do you want to kill children, right? And this is what they did in these massive ad buys, right? And this was an ad that ran in the Saturday Evening Post and in the most expensive magazines or the most expensive ad buys of the day. And they blanketed it. They used color, they used prominent placement, and every episode, every issue of these journals that they put it in, it would be in the same place every time. So it almost becomes like an editorial component within the magazine itself. But again, always this situational advertising that is used. So they were big innovators in this, and this really was something that started to spread out through the industry. People kind of took note. They wrote about them in these various advertising, like Printers Inc. and these kind of advertising trade journals. Everybody was pointing to the things that they were doing in that. Eventually, as their brand got more and more saturated, right, they didn't really have to do much of anything, because then they just became what you would call atmospheric, right? And so this is a great example of how they represented sound with their kind of branded graphics. They had a famous kind of engraver, Gaudi, who created a font for them, and everything was meant to look really expensive, right? And so after years and years of the situational safety thing, their brand was established, and then they just needed to kind of hit you with this stuff, right? And this was in motor age, but they did similar things. So this, I kind of argue that this, what they're doing is kind of a synesthesia, right? They're representing sound through visual. This is multimedia stuff, right? Very innovative in terms of size. So atmospheric ads were something that cars were doing, but again, because they had this leg ahead in the industry, and one of the things I describe in the book is how they used patent law and kind of trade law, kind of in terms of contract law and ordinance law to do this. So the patent law was extremely important. Patent law meant that this design they had for the horn, which is essentially just an electric motor with a lobbed wheel against a steel diaphragm, and when it gets faster, that's how the sound goes up, and as it gets slower, it goes down. So, ooh, yeah, right? They patented that technology, and they kept anybody else from producing it. And anybody who tried to produce it or sell it, they sued them. They kept them off the market. And at the time, you were able to use injunctions. So even if you filed a suit, it shut down the place that was producing it. So this is how they dealt with any competitor. They just sued them out of business. And so they were always in court, but they were, use their lawyers to keep them. So they had about a 10-year period, about a 10-year period, maybe not 7-year period, where they just kept every competitor out of the market. And because of that, were able to raise their price, and just any dollar that they had, they put into their advertising. They just had the most expensive, the most colorful, the most expensive ad buys that they could do. Again, all persuading people that awful noise was something that would keep you safe. And then they took it international, right? They used international patent law, international trade law, and they essentially created what we would think of as a franchise business today, right? Where they produced the horns, although they had to, because of some patent law, like in France, they had to have it be created by another subsidiary company, Blériot. And in Britain, they had to have it be produced to get around the kind of import laws. But they created the technology, they patented it, and then they created the look of these ads, and then they used market, right? So like McDonald's does today, they take care of the advertising, and everybody else kind of just has to stay to the price that they set. But as you can tell, this was Argentina, France, Italy, Canada, put that up there for you, Austria, Germany, Britain, right? And they swept the world with this, right? And everybody wanted this new technology. So again, as I was writing, so I was fascinated by the idea of early adopters, right? You know how people with tech have to be the first person to adopt. And they really peaked on that. They tapped into that idea. And so again, this aesthetic, the same types of ads like this one. This was one of their big ideas that they took all over the world. There's an ad in Italy, an ad in France. Essentially, the idea that this technology clears the road. Anybody who hears it just gets out of the way that those kids at the beginning got out of the way. Right? This is something that the brand was internationalized, but also had to be very local. And some of the ways that they localized the brand, some scholars call this globalization, right? In terms of these international franchises. So there's this campaign that just where the title of the book came from was I'll just call it this, can't remember exactly what but they announced this thing, which was their whole design had been forever. They wanted to be what Kodak was for photo photography, right? Which is to say a generic word that everybody thinks of immediately as soon as they think of the thing, right? And so what they decided to do was create these, at the time, people were starting to put signs up on the roads everywhere. So they said, let's do this. And they gave signs out with this words on it. This was the first announcing of this. This was again in the Saturday Evening Post. You can see the expensive looking etching aesthetic here, kind of brand distinction in the sociological sense. And then they would give out the signs to local automobile associations who would go out and put them up for it. So you get cross promotion here. Not only does it promote the brand, but it also, and the kind of generic
use of the term to mean car horn, but it also promotes and connects these cross-promotional things, right? So they sent out probably, this was started in 1914. They did this literally until like 1924 in Canada, in America, in South America, always the same thing, where they would give the signs out for free with the names of the people on the top of it and have them post them in dangerous places. They would then, just as terms of how their multimedia kind of cross-promotion worked, they would then make deals with local newspapers. This is for you. This is from the Indianapolis Star. And they would say, who wants to work with us? Which local newspaper wants to work with us? Give us one of your photographers and go out and take a picture of the horn, and we'll talk about how it protects local people and where they are, right? So this is the Crow's Nest, 2 miles north of Indianapolis. Do you know where that is?
No.
Anyway, but so this is kind of boilerplate stuff, but again, this franchise model, but the local term on it is getting the local newspaper photographer to slap the dangerous curve on there, right? So again, this is a way of franchising, but making it localized for them to work. They also did they had a boilerplate one that they did where this was kind of, it would be a little bit of text at the top, and then in the middle of it, they would say there would be some accident that had just happened and people were dying all the time. Like usually a kid. So-and-so was just struck by a car. On the bottom it would say, this wouldn't have happened had he had a clash. Right? So again, localizing this franchise model in terms of doing completely innovative advertising techniques, right? They were figuring out how to do this type of thing. Again, as their own national brand became, just the way that people talked about it, they just became more and more atmospheric. And this is the kind of their apex of this, and you see kind of where the press got that design for the art for this. So this is a great story about this. So this is Klaxon at Herald Square, New York, painted by the celebrated French futurist Francois Souet. You might have noted that was the apocryphal name of the count I gave. It was a ruse, right? So this is what the Futurists were doing, and the Futurists were a group that was kind of blurring the distinction between art and commerce, right? And they had this traveling exhibit in the places in Europe where Klaxon also had franchises, right? In Berlin, in London, in Paris. And everywhere they went, they just made bank because they sold their art, right? And so it blurred this high art distinction. And they also celebrated noise, right? They had this idea that the noise, the real noise was the noise of refined culture, and it was only what they called the noise sound of the avant-garde that would break through that stupor. So the key is the French didn't have futurists. This guy doesn't exist. It was made by the ad department, right? So in a sense, the exact same ruse that the futurists were doing, they did back home. And among the heavier background lines can be found the clang of trolleys, the rumble of elevated trams, the chugging of waiting motors, the grinding of taxicab brakes, the shout of van drivers, the voices of newsboys, the gongs of passing ambulance. Closer scrutiny reveals the fainter sounds, the shrill whistles of traffic police, can't you see it? The hum of the human voice and the shuffling feet of pedestrians, the nagging monotonous honk of the bullhorn. Above them all, sharp and penetrating, is the note of the klaxon. Klaxon had this idea, and they used kind of pseudoscience to do this, that their sound wave had a sawtooth cut. Right? They would print ads where you saw wavy sounds, normal sounds. Their branded sound had a sawtooth edge, so it cut through everything. Again, hogwash, right? But it worked in terms of branding. So again, and it just so happened that they did this in 1914, right as the war was ramping up, right? So they're the same idea that noise is really the thing that we have to embrace, and that it would essentially save culture. They're saying what you really need for noisy streets is just a louder noise that will cut through it. That's what keeps you safe. Okay, so that's kind of briefly where the history of the advertising that they went to. But again, very innovative in terms of how to sell technology. And that's what interested me in this story, was how they figured out, and again, eventually they first
when the situational ads, they were still using Madison Avenue people, but eventually they just put it all in-house. They created a thing called the Klaxon Press. They did all their art design in-house. And that really interested me, because if you think about Apple, it's really an advertising company, right? That's what it does well. That's what it has done. That, and like they did with their competitors, it kept anybody else from getting in the phone market for a long time by patenting the shape of the smartphone, right? So they had about 10 years where they had, they get in front of everybody else for that brand association, right? So it seemed to me like there were all these interesting connections, and that this was really the beginning of a way of communicating about technology that I think kind of heralds where we are now. Yeah.
Great. All right, let's open it up for questions. What questions do you have? Dr. Ali.
Matt, thank you so much for this. This is really exciting. I just bought the book too. I am wondering, can you tell us, where does the word Klaxon come from? Is that a name? Is it obviously it's a brand name, but is it a human's name, or how did we get to this word?
So the inventor brought it into the Lovell McConnell company and presented this thing to him. And again, it was just horrible sound. They're like, oh, wow. If you're in the business where you want to get things noticed, this gets you noticed, right? And that's what they would do everywhere they took it. But the name was actually the Greek word for shriek, right? So it's kind of a snooty way of the inventor was actually, again, somebody who he worked for Edison. He ended up running Edison's labs for like 20 years. He invented a thing called the acousticon, which helped deaf people. So Mark Twain quipped about him once that he invented the klaxon to make people deaf, and then the acousticon to help them hear afterwards. But it was just a marketing gimmick to create this word. And again, some of the things that interested me about this is that, so I came to write this story when I was on the search for something else. I was on sabbatical. I thought the book was going to be about how we create commodity quietness through mediation, right? I wanted to tell the story of the ear cancellation. Right? So I'm digging in the archives for solutions to how people dealt with the problem of noise. And I kept coming across this verb, klaxonner. What's that, right? It was in parliamentary papers in the Bibliothèque Nationale. That interested me. What is this word, where did it come from? And the fact that a brand name became part of the language, and it was that way in Spain, it was that way in Japan. I just found out it's still that way in Egypt, and kind of where the klax is still what they call car horns, right? And this technology doesn't exist, so how did this thing become so ingrained in culture that it's everywhere in the language? That was kind of what. So that Greek word then became kind of parlance for all.
I'm so excited about your book, and I can't wait to read it. And I know, like, we're in the same department, so we can talk endlessly. And I'll just ask one thing. I was so struck by, I was struck by two things, but it's the same thing. So the, mother need not worry. And on one of your ads, one of the latest ads you showed, there was something where there was klaxonet mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
There was a hand klaxon. Mm-hmm. And I thought both of those two things are really individualizing. And the whole idea of a klaxon, like, individualizes what could really be a huge structural problem for automobiles, which is they're killing us. Later we find out it's really like, globally, like apocalyptically killing us. But instead of having a systemic solution, or instead of us criticizing, the system and why are cars so perfect for our needs, because we're so individualized, and there's all this, the competition, like it just, and I even think about like the way single family homes are, and the suburbs, thank you to cars, and like all the individual labor that moms are expected to take on and all that. So just, it really seemed like the perfect technology for the individual to really like equip an individual. And obviously so are smartphones to equip an individual. And I just wonder, if you, like, where you might have talked about that, and also, do they market these for women as a safety device? Because they do that now, like, at me, being in the world as a woman, like on Instagram, they're always after me on Instagram to buy some like personal Klaxon, basically, you know what I mean? It's like, I think it would make anybody deaf, so I'm afraid to get it, because I'm already losing my hearing, and that would make me less safe anyways, to not hear the attacker creeping up behind me. So all that to say, there's a question in there somewhere. I don't know, just if you could comment on any of that.
So the reason for the different types of Klaxons is that they had to make them for different types of cars. Not all cars had alternators to create electrical current, hence the hand one. And so whenever they came up with a new model of it, oftentimes it was because somebody had created it, they sued them, said it's a patent infringement, and then made their own, and they would call it something different. In fact, they had, in a way that was kind of interactive with technology, they would do these readers, fandom really, to name the new horn, right? They would run a $250 prize in a national journal, name the new horn. And so, but they're all a version of Klaxon, right? So they had to do with different sizes of them, they had different horns. The reason for that Klaxon as well was because Ford didn't have alternators at the beginning, and that was the largest producer car, and so they had the button on it. In terms of the gender question, in the early ads, it was always appealing to the male driver, right? And the ads often featured women, but the women were the things that you were trying to protect. It would show usually a rich guy in a coat, and the woman sitting next to it and rearing horses around them, etc. So that this thing, the situation is, do you want to protect your good lady wife? Buy our horn. But as women became more adept at automobiling, they started to do advertising targeting women drivers. Again, not as many, because it was mostly driving is for men, right, in the early days. But that's the kind of gender dynamic. Mostly it was to protect the women and children. But eventually they started, as women became drivers, they started appealing to women as well.
Thanks, Matt. So with Klaxon, of course, I'm assuming they had a trademark on that name. Did they ever encounter trademark infringement? Like Klaxon started becoming genericized and people referred to any horn as a Klaxon. Because I know like companies like Johnson & Johnson, of course, they have to spend millions of dollars every year reminding everybody that Band-Aid is not a generic, it's a brand, and all that type of stuff. So I was wondering.
It's interesting. They almost, again, because they wanted it to be the generic, and they were very successful in doing that. They didn't really bust on anybody for doing that. They just sued them out of business for the most part. The horns that tried to get in, there was the Longhorn, there was the Spartan horn, there were these other ones that briefly popped up. The court cases, it went all the way to the Supreme Court. They had some appellate decisions that said, they had one judge, Judge Chatfield, who said you can patent a noise, right? So usually patent law revolves around the apparatus, the technology, but this guy hated these horns so much. He was like, these two things sound the same. This one has a patent. That gave them control over the market for a while. So when they started, actually, it's an interesting story, which I'll answer by way of how we got there. So the hand Klaxon, by about 1915, their court dominance over using it was over. And all of a sudden people are going to war, and the problem in war is that you also can't hear over noise, right? So the geniuses at Klaxon was said, hey, we've got something for you, something that'll, with its sawtooth wave, will cut through the problems in the trenches. This was especially important for gas alarms, right? The new kind of war technology of World War I was mustard gas. You would hear it, and then they the first year or two of it, people would just requisition whatever was around. They had gongs, they would take church bells, they would have whistles, the British had these little police rattles, they did all this stuff, but they didn't really work very much. So Klaxon created these, or they used these car horns then to become the sound of a gas alarm, right? So, and found all these discussions of how they would spread out from over 200 miles, because essentially like one trench would have it, another one would hear it, and they would go from like Paris to Switzerland in like a matter of minutes, several times a night, right? So they eventually had to keep anybody driving in the lines from actually using their horns. Became military laws. You can't use your horn. People were triggered, right? The soldiers were literally trained to do that. So this is where the association starts to lose, right? So in France, in the trenches, it becomes the sound you associate with, I'm gonna die from mustard gas. So when soldiers came back and they were walking down Madison Avenue and they heard the klaxon, they still dove to the ground. So culture was like, this is not good, right? You have to quiet the horns down. And for a while, people remember to use their horns, because again, this was before there were really laws about driving. At the time, the laws said, when you go through when you go through an intersection, you honk your horn. When you take a right turn, you honk your horn. When you back up, you honk your horn. When you go up a hill, you honk your horn. So the law, it's just like, so it's to let people know what you were doing. You were changing a little bit. People stopped doing that because the association was so bad. So back to your question about when the verb had become in France, had become kind of generic. It was used in juridical language. It was used in Parliament to debate noise ordinance. And everybody was bitching about the klaxon horn, right? And which by now, by the way, was not only Klaxon, it was Spartan Jackson, it was all these other providers of it. And in fact, every franchise, every place their country had it, they were sending them all to the front too, but they called them all klaxons. It was the generic term for the technology. So Klaxon Company said, wait, all these people are complaining in the press, complaining in court, complaining in kind of the Assembly Nationale about klaxon. So they would send these notes to trade journals and whatnot saying, don't use that word, call it a car horn. So that was really the only time when they were worried about, they were doing the opposite, saying, we were too successful making this thing a brand name, the generic, and now that people are complaining about it, please stop, right? So that was really that was the only time that they really flexed legal muscle to kind of around the brand name.
So what replaced the klaxon? Because I'm thinking of that like 4-tone musical sound that was in like tunes like Parisian Thoroughfare.
So what started eventually? So there toggled back and forth on different cities in the States who saying bulb horns was the way to go, right? And there are a lot of variants in bulb horn, and I write about Gershwin's American in Paris, because by that point, klaxons were illegal inside the city. They still called everything a klaxon, but it was really only bulb horns, and that was kind of Gershwin going from New York, where everything was right, to where he found very musical to be in the streets. So that piece is an ode to that very polyphonic bulb horn sound. And really what you start to get in the mid-20s as the early adopters no longer want these things. So Klaxon was eventually bought by United Motors. I think the owners of Lovell McConnell of the Klaxon brand realized we got to get out while the getting's good. They sold it to United Auto, which was a kind of an accessory maker, which eventually became Rini Delco. And then General Motors bought it. And once General Motors bought it, and once it was sold and put on, it was on everything in the factory. So instead of being something you decided as a consumer, I want my horn to sound like this, you got things out of the factory and they sounded Oga. So by the mid-20s, people who want to have their own personality come out through their car horn say, let's get rid of the klaxon and we'll put something else on. So I read about The Great Gatsby, right? The Great Gatsby has a 3-tone horn.
And these are kind of throwbacks to the old musical horns. One of the early technologies that they used were essentially adaptations of whistle technology. You just stuck it on the exhaust pipe, right? And so there was one company, the Gabriel, that made a 10-tone version one of that with a little keyboard you could play in the passenger seat. Right? And so the horns now, by the time you get to the Great Gatsby, who was kind of had this kind of old, yellow Rolls Royce, they had the new 3-toned air compressed horns, and that's what eventually starts to replace it. So Klaxon itself, by about 1927, starts advertising the compressed air horn. They still call it Klaxon, but the sound of it is no longer a wooga, right? It's now toot toot. It's now honk honk. It's what we think of now as kind of 2-tone compressed air horns, and that's kind of the thing that replaced it. So the ideas of it, the affordances of it, instantaneous loud technology that you don't have to fumble with, it honks immediately. Still the same, but the sound association was so toxic by that. And so it becomes always a throwback after this. So by the time you get to things where you can look at the sound association, films from the 1930s, it's always Rubes and Hicks that have Klaxons on the horns. The new sophisticated people have those, honk honk horns or musical horns that make different things. It's already a throwback technology. So that again, that becomes part of the interesting thing of the story is how did this thing that was an early adapter technology become something that was like, MySpace.
I have a question about the public health implications. So is there any evidence to support their argument that the introduction of the klaxon was actually associated with reduced traffic-related injuries or fatalities, or was it all just gobbledygook?
It was all gobbledygook, right? But they were, again, as you can do if you're blanketing the country with advertising, people were dying and the fatality rates were going up. And they said, we'll fix this, right? So when the fatality rates didn't go up and when people started complaining about the noise, in the 1920s, every city went through anti-noise kind of politics. LaGuardia won election after election in New York. Chicago, election after election, all around noise. And the klaxon became this signpost for people complaining about noise, right? Because it was individuals who were keeping them up at night. And nothing irritates you more. So what they started doing then was when the numbers didn't work out, you see the exact opposite health messaging. After the war, there's a tremendous amount of medical literature that is about noise, right? They started studying noise from a health perspective. They did noise tests. New York did this in the forums, guy free. So you see all these pictures of these people going out because a new machine had been invented called the decibel meter. And you could go and you could put it out in different places in the city, and you could take readings. And they eventually, they did this in Britain and France, and they figured out, wait a minute, this causes people stress, especially soldiers when they heard this. They had this, this tendency. They created soldiers' hospitals, required quiet and everything. They go out on the street and it's blah. So the medical literature was saying people need quiet. And so it kind of started to go against the marketing language. So what they started to do is search for new solutions that would actually address the safety problem. This is where you start seeing optical signals. And so traffic lights, there are all these neat products that people started to use, like they sold gloves so that you could stick your arm out the window and say, I'm turning, right? Brake lights on the back, all these things that would allow people to communicate in a way that wasn't sound. And then they started changing the laws saying, no, when you go through an intersection, you don't need to honk. In fact, we're gonna fine you if you do. And they always justify this in the name of public health, in the name of public safety. So they moved toward traffic signals. And by the mid-1920s, you start to see traffic signals pop up in cities. One of the reasons why is during the war, they had created these timed electrical delays for uses in the trenches. And that kind of timed electrical delay was what they used on traffic lights, right? So you could just time traffic lights. So you see traffic lights spreading throughout the world. And as they spread throughout the world, along with this medical discourse that says
too much noise makes people unhealthy, that all flips.
Hey Matt, so that's really interesting, and just thinking about the point you were just making there in terms of sort of the reversal of talking about, that the health implications of the noise. I know that Klaxon, you had explained they kind of made those signs and the danger, Klaxon, but I guess how much of an influence did they have on sort of sending that reversal of a message in terms of like traffic expectations and rules and stuff? Like, were they really the main force saying like everyone should be honking at traffic intersections, or was that existing before?
No, that was the existing law that they exploited. They had a really great marketing. Again, they were just geniuses at marketing. So they had this thing called the Sane Safety Signal Campaign, which used local salesmen as lobbyists and had ads that went along with it. And that was every state, every ordinance, pretty much, they had to say, you have to use an adequate safety signal so that people can hear you. Of course, as things got louder and louder, what countered it? So they made this move to say bullhorns were not an adequate safety signal. And then they would go into every municipality with boilerplate legislation, maybe give them a little extra money under the table, and city after city would adopt the legislation that they recommend, the way lobbyists do, right? In your world, right? And then every time a city would adopt the legislation, they would run a national ad. Seattle adopts sane signaling legislation. New York, Chattanooga, right? So it creates the notion that there's this consensus sweeping the country that the only adequate signal that keeps you safe is a klaxon, right? So again, it's a combination of the ordinance law that was existing for the honk honk, and then them kind of steering the conversation through the press, right? Through legislation, through lots of native advertising, right? They would get friendly reporters to write moral columns saying the good parents have to use this horn. All the things that you associate with the way kind of technology works today.
Thanks, Matt. I want to come back around to Matt McAllister's first question about advertising. And so, it seems like Klaxon was in a world of hurt at the end of World War I, because, so how did Klaxon, did Klaxon try to come up with an advertising campaign to try to address this?
Yes.
Okay, can you talk about that?
So in the 20s, they had lost their brand distinction as being something you could just charge a buttload for, right? And what they went to is a kind of a mass, they sold it directly to factories. And in fact, they were selling so much product, they lobbied the Department of Transport to say that we deserve a lower import tax on trucking these things everywhere to factories, right? And again, remember the 20s were really when cars were just rolling off the assembly line. So what they did was they used what I call recombinant media, right? They used all of their old slogans, all of their old campaigns, combining them in different ways, and they did what they used to do, which is just, we're gonna blanket everything with advertising. Same Saturday Evening Post ad buys, really great ads. They just had no traction, right? The public was gone. And so they tried what they had used before. Let's just advertise. And they spent a lot of money on advertising to do this. And it didn't work, right? Because that sense of perception had shifted, that nobody wanted to hear the sound. So they could convince people it was keep you safe, and they had, ads with children playing in the streets or carts in the way, and that sawtooth thing would be triggering them out of their stupor. It didn't work. Just didn't work. Not that they didn't try. They tried everything. They threw the kitchen sink at it. They tried public relations. They tried massive advertising buys, and they just didn't get any traction.
So you discussed various ingenious advertising campaigns that the Klaxon company used, but would you say that the association to that, like, as you described it, the wooga sound, was like the carrying strength of why Klaxon exploded, or would you credit it more to like the ingenious advertising?
Yes. It's a little bit of both. Like there were other really loud signals. Like, and there was another competitor in the early days called Sireno, right? Siren. And their idea, Klaxon claimed to be the half mile ahead horn. Sireno was, we were the mile ahead horn. And the idea would be you'd just be driving, and just the siren would be going all the time. Everybody got out of the way. Eventually that didn't work because countries everywhere said, no, sirens are for emergency vehicles, you can't use that. So there were other really loud technologies. And so Klaxon, again, this is where their lobbying went to work. They would say, ours is loud, it's appropriately loud, theirs are noisy. And friendly legislatures would say, no more for you, right? And so it was a combination of its effectiveness as a signaling device, again, that you could hit it immediately, and then it really carried, and advertising and lobbying around technology. So it's a little of both, and they were just super aggressive. They took no prisoners, right? They just mutilated competition. And so if they saw you as a competitor, they went after you with everything. Their lawyers were very busy. So it's always a little bit of both.
Okay, so maybe one last question.
Yeah, what about policing? What about once the horn started getting looked at as a nuisance? And I'm also thinking that like the wanting to be quiet is like a very white cultural kind of, ideal. And being an Italian American from maybe the last generation that thinks of themselves as Italian American, people in my family were still telling each other to quiet down in a kind of more to assimilate to being like WASP culture, right? So I just wonder if the Klaxon like plays into any of that.
I think so. I mean, I think the brand distinction was going for kind of as rich and sophisticated as possible. And that seems to be something that is associated with quietness. I mean, you look at the quietness now as a marketing feature, like the Cadillac has quiet touring, which is the ads showing you shutting all sound out, right? So you're right, there's a kind of a class and whiteness distinction to that. In terms of the policing question, again, it's another interesting thing. Ted might see, I love these inversions. So in the early days, the policing was done to make sure you were honking every time you were supposed to. So the first people to put up those signs were police who would say, blow your horn, right? And if you missed it, they would be on the other side of the bridge and they would pull you over and fine you. It's interesting, the automobile associations got wind of this and they would write in their journals, like, look out for, in Pittsburgh, at this so-and-so intersection, there's a trap there. So the early policing was making sure you were complying to honk your horn whenever you were supposed to. Later on, though, as the noise politics grew, that became things that police did. Especially once they got the decibel things and they knew the bad zones and they had sonically mapped the city of New York, for example, they sent out these people to give you fines immediately. You honked in different spaces, like New York established things called quiet zones in front of hospitals and schools. You honked there, fine. If you honked after 6 o'clock, fine, right? So the ordinances became more strict in terms of where you could use a horn, and the policing was then used to kind of end. Again, not like people ever stopped doing this. In Paris, in Madrid, I think is the best story. The politics, the anti-noise politics got turned up to 11. And what they did was they started fining taxis. We did it. The taxis went on strike and spent days just honking their horn. Right? Eventually, they said, no, screw it, this isn't going to work. Right? So you see these similar things happening in every city that's trying to get control of the noise. So policing mostly is used in relation to keeping the sound down, which, back to the class question,
Yeah.
probably why.
Okay, well, I'm just going to put one more plug out for sales of the book. You can order it at the University of Virginia Press. You can also get it on Amazon and other retail outlets. Very much encourage you. Thank you, Dr. Jordan, for a great talk. Very great project. Please join me in congratulating. And of course, Dr. Jordan is happy to continue